Our team's been using AI for research pretty much since day one. When ChatGPT dropped, it was GPT 3.5. Put it to work almost immediately, not as hobbyists or testing things out, but immediately put it to work in a professional context. Before we started Mora.io, we ran a research and consulting firm, Sourced Economics. And we did client projects for big accounts like Coca-Cola and Whirlpool Corporation and Kimberly-Clark, Smithfield Foods, work with their executive teams to, in short, bring the academic research perspective to an industry audience. So that's, VPs of strategy, financial planning, et cetera. And again, so we started using ChatGPT right away. As many of you know, the early models were really tough. You could see kind of the magic, you could see the potential, but you had lots of problems. You had tons of hallucinations, fake DOIs, fake citations, really could barely handle analyzing a single PDF. Certainly, if you upload, let's say, 2 or 3 PDFs, couldn't handle it. What I'll say is these tools and models today are pretty much unrecognizable from that point 4 or 5 years ago when we started using these products. I want to kind of highlight and lay out what we actually learned through those 4 or 5 years, rules that I think will be very helpful going forward as well, what we've learned about using LMs for research in a real world practical context. So I actually dug out an old screenshot of the first version of ChatGPT. I guess it doesn't look all that different, but you can actually go through, and if you search, you remember an early topic you worked on ChatGPT, you can find like your first chat ever. And certainly we could find the chats we worked on for the first year. It's kind of amazing. So we went back through old, let's say, client projects and took a look at what the site was good at, what it was not good at. The very first thing I noticed just before anything else is the UI and the outputs were so much harder to consume at that point. And that's something where Claude has made a real advancement compared with ChatGPT. So many bullet points, so high level, very little kind of definitive hypotheses and opinions. And so you had to really, really work at the outputs. Iteration is, spoiler alert, something that's going to be important forever in using these tools. You need more and more iteration, more and more back and forth. But it was especially important if you were trying to come up with good, business quality deliverables 4 years ago using a ChatGPT. So tons of iteration. Hallucinations were constant. They weren't kind of occasional. It was all the time. You had plausible summaries of papers that didn't exist. You have DOIs that didn't exist. Sourcing was pretty much impossible. So you could not use a ChatGPT to, for example, find papers on a topic. What's more, it was very hard to get the model in subsequent models to actually cite sources. That's why a product like Perplexity really took off, because it advertised itself as really the only big model that could cite sources well. And so a lot of businesses stayed kind of their whole models on the notion that it would be too hard for the big LLMs to cite sources anytime in the near future. Spoiler alert, they've become a lot better at that, of course. And even if you can't cite sources, you don't have sources cited, you can generally ask for the models to cite their sources. And then what's more, and maybe most important for our work, is that context windows were really, really small. Again, you could use maybe 1 PDF, 2 PDFs you couldn't use. You could not introduce a whole Excel database. Context windows just couldn't handle it, how much you could actually input into the site. Where we are today, I don't want to overgeneralize, but most folks have switched over to from OpenAI's ChatGPT to Anthropic's Claude for most use cases. If you haven't, I hate to be kind of narrow-minded, but you really should, or you should start exploring Claude more. That's maybe the biggest industry change. Really unexpected, happened very fast. Hallucinations are way less frequent. They still happen, but without a doubt less frequent, especially on well-studied topics. Most data points now come with sources, or again, you can just ask them for sources if you need them. A tool like Claude and even ChatGPT can now certainly surface 3 to 5 seminal papers on a topic, and based on our testing, can actually surface more like 30 papers very reliably. If you do, say, 50 or 100, you'll get a lot of hallucinations still, but if you need 30 solid academic paper sources, Claude actually does it better than not only some of the traditional search engines like Google Scholar, but even some of the newer AI literature search engines like Elicit or SciSpace or Consensus. Claude search is very good, at least for a limited number of papers. And the context window issue, you wouldn't say is solved, but you can certainly manage multiple PDFs through Claude. You can certainly handle, and ChatGPT for that matter, you can handle a big data sets, big tables. You can really operate via systems now rather than just individual chats. And that is the biggest change in my own work, for what it's worth, is no longer treating chats as just kind of one-off commands. Now, pretty much my whole day-to-day workflow flows through or funnels through Claude via projects, via Claude code, via, Claude chats that are pinned and cleaned up and used regularly. I think the most important lesson from the last 4 or 5 years is that you need constant iteration. Everything needs to be iterative. You see this with a lot of the vertical AI tools out there. Needs to be a ton of human context and back and forth involved. I'd say the biggest mistake researchers make, and in particular grad students make, is treating these models like vending machines a little bit. You just kind of put in your prompts and expect a really good output. You see a lot of people talking in terms of, say, generate a literature review in 5 minutes, which A, really misunderstands the purpose of a literature review, and B, misunderstands the capabilities of these models and how to best leverage them, let's say. How I actually use these chats generally in these models is you've got 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 back and forths, maybe to work on one particular paper, or even one section for that matter, one research question, one research strategy. Here I actually just put together a really simple example. This is about the shortest chat you're going to find on my Claude account, at least, is give me a good research topic on this question, specifically a query for Google Scholar. Here, this really is not a good query format for Google Scholar, so this includes cite quotations. There's also too many. Simplify further. Great, we've got a simplification. I'd like to explore some cross-disciplinary literature, call those out, produce a larger list, etc. Again, this is a really simple demo. If you look at the stuff I very seriously work on, this, I don't know how to describe it. This little scroll bar is like tiny, 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 which brings me to another best practice. You should, as much as possible, actually ask a chat you've been running for a long time to summarize its key contents, and you should start a new chat to reduce the context windows and make sure it doesn't get too slow. Having said that, you need to give context, you need to push back, you need to add nuance, feed with your own knowledge, your own instincts, your own hypotheses. And I describe it often as going through the same evolution, AI for research, as software development. The early software development apps, and some of the current ones still, are kind of like, write me a whole application with one prompt. That didn't work very well. And so what works is instead go one at a time, change this, fix, try this different approach, and it's a constant back and forth. I think the researchers getting the most out of AI are the ones still willing to put in the work. There's going to be a significantly larger quality bump rather than efficiency bump than people are anticipating, in my view. And that means we still need to put in the work. I've got a Scholarly Kitchen article going out shortly with the librarian from New England College of Optometry. And the topic is what stages of the research process should be and will be automated to the greatest extent. When it comes to using both kind of horizontal big LLMs and more some of the vertical tools, I'm pretty kind of unapologetic in saying that every single stage of the literature review and research process should involve AI. In discovery, you really should be using the big LLMs to understand at a high level a particular area of literature. I get a lot of crap for saying this, but every literature review should really start with a high level prompt in Claude, let's say, that says, tell me about the big evolutions in and consensus in this area of research. Not all the information will be perfect, but it's the only tool that can do that versus some that say just summarize the top 10 search results they produce. You should also be using the more vertical AI literature search engines to find diamonds in the rough, in short. Figure out if there are any papers that are very specific to your topic, empirical methods, your inclusion-exclusion criteria, that you didn't find in Google Scholar or Scopus or any other tool you use. For both narrative and systematic reviews, search strategy is an area that should be, in my opinion, much more automated and technology enabled with AI. Finding keywords, figuring out how to incorporate Boolean operators, etc. As you go further down the life cycle, the research process, it should be, in my view, in short, less and less automated. But even with full text reviews, you can ask questions about papers. You can do a lot of very effective data extraction. You can also further screen papers in full text review using data extraction. Evidence synthesis, pretty straightforward. Find patterns, identify gaps, and start draft your summaries. And then for writing, this should be the most iterative process at all. Writing is the area where we put a special touch on our work, where we really understand the intricacies of prior literature and how one sentence maybe changed, prior researchers' views on a particular field. And so needs to be a lot of nuance. I generally use models and some verticalized writing tools to tighten up my sentences, to make more cohesive arguments, but it really starts with my own inputs. So it really comes down to this. AI is most helpful for automating the tedious mechanical stuff. Think about things like managing citations, mapping references and citations to particular findings, extracting structured data, formatting references, formatting in some contexts. You have a good paper, you need to format it in the template of a particular journal or something like that. Automate all of this as aggressively as possible. There are no foundational research skills lost within these tasks of the research process. For everything else, let's call it the creative interpretive work. Again, the creative writing, the really nuanced stuff. That is where AI is still helpful, but least helpful. Your research question, your gap, what your findings mean, your voice. AI can definitely support these. It's like a thinking partner, maybe a brainstorming partner in that sense, coming up with a research question, say, but the moment you outsource that thinking, your work starts to look like everyone else's because it's trained on, obviously, not only prior work, but kind of the consolidation and aggregates of prior work. And the point I always harp on is that researchers, like software developers, like sales and marketing professionals, should use multiple tools and get very good at nailing down what I call their research stack, their tech stack for research that has multiple different applications for multiple different stages of the process, ideally that work well together also. You need both, say, Claude or ChatGPT, so you need horizontal LLMs, which are very good for reasoning, writing, iterating, answering questions, being maybe a brainstorming partner. These are probably the best use case of horizontal models. But they generally don't have your library. They don't deduplicate. They don't screen formally generally. They don't verify your metadata against Crossref and PubMed. There's that mechanical stuff that should especially happen with vertical tools that are set up for those specific tasks. So you need both. You need the big LLMs for some of that work, and then you need the vertical LLMs and vertical tools like our product Mora, Mora.io, to manage references, to ask. There is, in my view, I am always, for any business function, sort of making a decision between the two. Do I use a horizontal model for this and maybe say set up my own system with Claude Code or with Claude Projects, or do I procure an off-the-shelf vertical product that's specifically made for this task? It's always going to be a balance between the two. Okay, so that is 4 or 5 years. Again, let's call it 4 years in 8 minutes. And let me just rattle them off. Tools have gotten dramatically better. Iterate, don't one-shot this thing. AI is best for the tedious stuff, not the creative stuff. In my view, you kind of know it when you see it, and use more than one tool. So I can talk about this stuff all day, every day. In fact, I generally do talk about this stuff all day, every day. If anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm john@mora.io. More content like this is coming, kind of breakdowns, the real workflows we work on, how we use these tools. I'll link to our product in the description, but further, we're just kicking off our YouTube channel. Would greatly appreciate if you'd subscribe. So really appreciate the time, everyone.